People like to talk about slavery in the past tense, but slavery never ended. Across the world now, literally hundreds of thousands of people, children, teenagers, adults, they're being coerced and kidnapped, trafficked and exploited across the globe. Some of them promised opportunities, some of them smuggled across borders, and then some are trapped in debt that they're never going to be able to repay. And when they eventually arrive in places like the United Kingdom, the reality really hits home because their passports are taken, their freedom's gone. Control is handed over to these criminal gangs who see them not as human beings, but as commodities. And many of them are forced into the sex trade, locked in filthy rooms in bedsits, moved from place to place, used by men who choose not to ask questions. And some of these people are underage. And every single man who pays into that system is part of it. Every single one. And I want you to hold that image in your mind, because against that backdrop sits one of the darkest scandals in modern Britain, the grooming gang cases. For years, in towns across this country, vulnerable girls have been targeted. Not the protected, not the privileged, the forgotten. These are girls from broken homes, girls already known to social services, girls crying out, sometimes literally for help. And what happened? They were ignored, dismissed, written off as troubled. Meanwhile, the abuse continues, and it continues to this day, systematically, repeatedly, and in some cases quite openly. It wasn't hidden in the shadows. We had got taxi drivers, in takeaways, known locations, known patterns of behaviour, and many people would have seen things or suspected things. And right now, while all of this is already known, there are still delays when it comes to fully confronting it. We've seen the absolute joke, which is this national inquiry, so that Rupert Lowe has had to crowdfund to try and do his own independent one. And whilst these politicians in Parliament are debating and deferring, like I said, we've got Rupert Lowe, who is trying his hardest to, piece together the full picture of what's going on. And instead of unified support for him, what do we see? Dismissal, mockery, criticism over his budget, over the scope, over the fact that it's him doing the investigating. But this should never have been about ego. It should never be about who gets the credit. It should be about one thing only. Getting to the truth and making sure that nothing like this ever happens again anywhere in the world. Because when the focus shifts from the victims to politics, something has gone drastically wrong. Now ask yourself this. Why the hesitation? Why the delays? Why does it feel like pulling teeth to get full transparency? Because ultimately, when multiple agencies fail repeatedly over years, it's got to be something more than oversight. It starts looking like culpability or avoidance. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Who stayed silent? Who looked at what was happening to those children and chose not to have the moral courage to say something about it? Because it wasn't just the perpetrators. There were people around them who must have known something. Family members, associates, people in the same communities. Now, not all, but enough of them so that the question has to be asked, why didn't they come forward? Because silence can never be neutral in a situation like that. Silence protects the abusers. But then also on top of that, we've got the system. Police forces that failed to act, social services that didn't intervene, local authorities that downplayed what was happening. Even when the victims came forward, they weren't believed. Reports were written down diligently, but never followed up. And the patterns must have emerged, in some central headquarters when they assess all of these different reports from across the country. And they just weren't confronted. Why? Some reviews have pointed, to this fear inside the institutions of being accused of being racist, of getting it wrong, reputational damage, inflaming community tensions. But here's the reality. When fear stops you from protecting a child, something has gone fundamentally wrong. And every single person that was complicit in what happened and knew about it should hang their heads in shame, because protecting the vulnerable is the first duty in any society. Everything else comes after that. And when that duty is compromised, whether through incompetence, hesitation, or misplaced priorities, the consequences, as we can clearly see, are devastating. And there are some more uncomfortable truths in this story. You know, there was patterns that showed up in certain cases, questions about whether those patterns, understanding who the perpetrators were disproportionately, whether they were ignored or why they weren't confronted early enough. And I don't want to reduce this to blanket blame, because at that point we will lose precision about who was actually to blame. Because you see, hyenas act like hyenas. But where were the shepherds to protect the flock from the hyenas? To caveat that though, without precision, there can't be any real accountability, because the truth is this: the responsibility sits definitely with the men who committed the crimes, but also the individuals who enabled or ignored them, and the institutions that failed to act when it mattered most. The slogans are irrelevant, the deflection disgraceful. They didn't address the facts. And even when justice comes in this, if it comes at all, it'll feel incomplete, because there may be a number of prosecutions, there may be some convictions and some jail sentences, so that those in power can feel like something's been done. But for the victims, the question's always going to remain: why did it happen to me, and why does it still continue today? You cannot protect a society by avoiding difficult truths, and marginalising one group to favour another. You protect it by facing these issues, these facts directly, honestly, and without hesitation. No child should ever been put in that position, and no victim should ever feel like that or be ignored like that. And certainly no institution should ever, ever, ever be allowed to prioritise its reputation or community relations or appease a certain minority group over the safety of the people it exists to protect. Because when that happens, it's not just failure, but it's treason. It's treason against the people of this country.